Shall we start? Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the first session of the last day of the conference. Today I'm hosting two young researchers, young researchers. The first one is Ms. Yasar, which is a doctoral candidate at Sciences Po in Paris. And her thesis is mainly dealing with disruptive innovation in the merger control area, and she's actually talking about something very related to it, which is achieving symbiosis between disruptive innovation and merger control. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited about today because this is the first time I'm presenting this research, so all comments are really more than welcome. And so this is part of my PhD research. I'm researching all areas of competition law in relation to disruptive innovation. I just started my PhD, so haven't come too far, but this research is something I started in 2016, so I'm developing it and it's work in progress, so please feel free to be as mean as you wish. Okay, so disruption is again, we are talking about many buzzwords since Wednesday, and like big data or privacy, and another one of our age is obviously disruption. And now it's getting to be a craze. People want to disrupt themselves. Even Harvard Business Review says, be paranoid. Like everybody wants to come up with the next best product. Everybody wants to sell it to a big tech company. So there's a lot of hype going on around the idea of disruption. And this is also how I got the idea. When I was working as a lawyer, I realized that there were a lot of startups being bought by big tech companies, but none of these mergers were actually notified. And when I asked myself the question, then I realized this was back in 2014, 2015. Well, because the startups or potential disruptors, they don't have any turnover, so we weren't notifying these transactions, although they seem to have a lot of importance for the markets, and these transactions seem to have a lot of cause a lot of change in the structure of industry. So that's how I got the idea. And this research I started as my master's dissertation. So I analyzed, you can see in the paper, mergers where disruptive innovation was considered to be a positive factor, a contributive factor to the clearance. But the second part, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, is disruptive innovation as a sword. These are the cases where, potential disruptors are being bought by incumbents, and how we can deal with these. As you probably all know, the idea of disruptive innovation goes back to Schumpeter, his idea of creative destruction, the gales of creative destruction, the idea of in industries, nothing is permanent. So we'll get to that later. Anyway, so we know that. And still, I would like to define disruptive innovation in terms of how I perceive it, because there's still, although we talk about disruptive innovation and disruption, there's still no consensus as to what it means. When it first came out as a business theory by Clayton Christensen, he defined the disruptive innovation as technologies. Well, his idea is disruptive technologies, as technologies having very different characteristics and usually lower quality. And because they were lower quality, they would be cheaper and user-friendly. So they secure a place at the lower end of the market, but then they evolve and become fully performance competitive, and they displace incumbents completely. So this was his idea of, at the end of the 20th century, this was his idea of disruptive technologies. And he argued that incumbents who fail to catch the wave of disruption, such as the case of Kodak failing to get into the digital cameras market, they would be killed and disappear, basically. But this definition has been criticized, and I think it's important for competition law enforcement because when we discuss disruption in terms of competition law, we see that these technologies or these businesses, they completely change the structure of markets. This is what I'm looking at. So I'm not only looking at technologies. For me, disruptive business models are also as relevant for competition law enforcement as disruptive technologies. And also, well, just to give you a couple of examples, for example, a lot of competition lawyers don't agree that Uber is a disruptive innovation. But in my sense, for my research, I look at all technologies and business models that either displace incumbents, but it can be in the sense of full displacement or partial displacement of incumbents, or basically innovations that have a fundamental impact on the functioning of industries. So this is disruptive innovation for the purposes of my research. And of course, when we say disruptive innovation, what is the opposite of that? It's incremental innovation, and this is also important for my research because usually when we look at literature and studies on innovation and competition law, we know that these focus mostly on incremental innovation, sustaining innovation. These are innovations that basically develop existing products or basically better them to satisfy the existing customer bases. And very easy examples are the pharmaceutical industry, agrochemicals, or basically any technological product that you may see developing. And most of the literature that is currently the basis of my research is on incremental innovation, and also many of the decisions that we see, the case law is also on incremental innovation, but as we will see in a moment, still the theories used for incremental innovation, they can be adapted, in my view, to disruptive innovation. So where does disruption come from? So here we have the Schumpeter-Arrow, the famous Schumpeter-Arrow dichotomy. Schumpeter argued that in capitalism, in markets, nothing is constant, so we have constant scales of creative destruction, and therefore, even if we have a monopolist, that monopolist may be displaced in a very short term, so we shouldn't rely on short-term indicia, especially, and the Schumpeterian school believe that this is particularly true for the tech markets, and we have the mainstream examples, obviously, of MySpace and Facebook, or Blockbuster and Netflix. And Schumpeter also argued that monopolies, since they had more resources for research, they were more prone to coming up with this kind of destructive innovations. On the other hand, we had Arrow, who argued that competitive markets were more prone to producing innovations. And then these two were sort of nuanced in Aghian's work, and he argued that there's a reverted U-shaped relationship between innovation and concentration, and he believed that innovation would most likely to come from relatively concentrated markets. But when we look at the practice, we see that actually innovation comes from all directions. I don't think for the purposes of disruptive innovation we should take any strong stance. I think we need to understand that it can come from basically anybody. For example, Apple. We all know that it disrupted itself. You know, it had the iPod, a very valuable product, but then it saw the telecommunications and the smartphone potential coming, so it disrupted itself by creating the iPhone, and basically nobody uses iPods anymore. Very few people. I don't want to say nobody, but very few people use them. But also we have, well, especially in terms of business models, we have a lot of businesses that were previously small, or they were working in garages, of course the usual tale, and they don't come from monopolists, or they make the markets. This is the idea of disruptive innovation. You don't necessarily look at people who are established in a market, they create the market. So in that sense, I think we have to be open to the idea that when we are analyzing competition, disruption can come from any direction. Apple disrupting itself, Netflix disrupting itself. It had a very established business model of video deliveries, but then it saw streaming coming, so it just basically gave up its established business model and then went into streaming. Or we have Dollar Shave Club. Maybe it hasn't necessarily replaced the razor market, but we have in the US we have deliveries of razors at home at a cheaper price, and they argue better quality. And Unilever paid a lot of money to buy that product, or Airbnb or Uber. So you get the idea. And I think this is important for our analysis of competition law. So one other thing that I would like to discuss before I move on to the competition law analysis is I think we gotta understand the reasons behind disruptive acquisitions, because I think also one other thing we need to understand is in practice we are looking at a very established system. How does merger control work? We have a merger, parties come, the competition authority looks at the markets, it defines the markets, and then it analyzes the actual competition in the market share analysis, and then if we are lucky, it moves on to the potential competition analysis, but potential competition is taken into account if the entry is very imminent. So we are looking at this traditional established idea of merger control analysis. But I think when it comes to disruptive innovation, we have to revise our understanding of substitutability, our understanding of network effects, or the value of data. I mean, we've been discussing these a lot for the past 3 days, so I don't want to repeat everything, but to understand the reasons behind the mergers, I think it provides for better remedies and better understanding of competition between the acquirer and the acquired company. So 3 main reasons we can establish when it comes to disruptor acquisitions. First of all, it can be actually to spur the innovation. For example, in the case of Google buying YouTube, well, at the time, YouTube was actually tackling with a lot of copyright cases. So there's a lot of argument that YouTube wouldn't have survived those had it not been for Google. When it was acquired by Google, Google of course managed to negotiate them all together. And of course, dealing with a small disruptor versus dealing with Google, it makes a huge difference when it comes to court. So there are many people who argue that YouTube was saved thanks to the Google acquisition. Of course, it was a great product, so Google would have wanted to buy it, but that's another story. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, of course, to eliminate competition. And I think, allegedly that was why Facebook acquired Instagram. That's why Facebook attempted to acquire Snapchat many times, because you see a threat, and especially in the digital world, incumbents, because of nowcasting, they receive, especially like search engines or social media, they receive so much clicks, and they can understand, and some say even better than competition authorities, what the market trends are. So they have a better position in terms of understanding whether a disruption is coming. So they see the disruption coming, they either copy the business model or the product, or the easiest way is to acquire. And the third reason is to have access to the disruptor's data, obviously, and the data processing technology, because when they're acquired, the consumer data goes with the disruptor. And unfortunately, I think these reasons were somewhat ignored in some of these acquisitions that I listed over there. For example, the easiest one is Facebook, Instagram. That wasn't notifiable to the EU Commission, but the OFT reviewed it at the time in 2012. And Instagram was seen as a photo app, and since it was not perceived as a social media app, the merger was perceived as really non-problematic, very short decision. But I'm not sure, I'm not sure if that was a political choice or not, but anybody who talked to a couple of teenagers or went on the internet, read a few tech sites, would have perceived that Instagram was a truly viable competitor to Facebook. So letting that merger go so easy, I think that was a mistake. And how we can find that the element of competition out in these acquisitions? Well, there are many ways. We can look at the internal documents of companies. well, this is a bit disputed, but I think there are still a lot of indicia in terms of these reasons in the internal documents of companies, and of course, competition authorities have a lot of fact-finding resources. We can look at the SEC filings, or we can talk to the competitors, the customers of the companies. Well, we can go on the internet. There are many nerdy tech sites that I always browse. So there are a lot of elements that you can find out as to the dynamics of competition in these markets. And I think they shouldn't be ignored. And I think that would help the merger analysis. So let's now move on to the analysis of the disruptor acquisitions. So what happens first, and this is also another thing we've been discussing, we first have to notify the merger in order for the competition authority to review it. But these mergers, as I mentioned in the beginning, many of them are not notifiable because they don't trigger the turnover thresholds, obviously. The second step is market definition. The third step is to have a framework to analyze the dynamics of competition in these mergers. Then, if we are going to, if we see competitive issues, what is the theory of harm? Can we block the merger? Can we require remedies? Then, if so, remedies, what can the remedies be? I'm not going to delve too much into that, but still, I think it has to be there. And the final part is to take a look back and see whether we've done a good job with the merger review. So notifying the merger, of course, as you all know, there's a lot of hype going on around that as well. The EU Commission launched a public consultation on this 2 years ago. Why? Because many believe that there's an enforcement gap, and these mergers are not caught by competition laws. And since they have big impact in the market, we should do something about it. That was the initial idea. So the public consultation is over, and the EU published the submissions, but there hasn't been any action yet. And when we look at the submissions, we see that many actually believe that there's no enforcement gap. And one of the most cited reasons is the fact that member states have already such as the UK, some merger control tests that allow these mergers to be notified to member state competition authorities. Therefore, there's no need to do anything at the EU level. But some actually competition authorities propose that there should be value-based thresholds as a complement. What I mean by value is the value of the merger, obviously, because we see startups that have no turnover being acquired for billions of euros. Of course. Then the idea of value comes into the picture. But at the same time, the opponents of this view say that, and I personally agree with that, the value of a merger is very volatile and even sometimes hard to find out because they are not open to the public, or there are many different schemes as to how you can pay for a company. I mean, it becomes very hard to calculate, and also I think you can go around the value of a merger in order not to notify the merger. Turnover still remains a much more objective criteria. But still, after the public consultation, Germany and Austria, they introduced value thresholds. So I take the view that yes, I believe some of these mergers should go before the competition authorities, but the value threshold may not be the best idea. But this has been introduced in some member states, and actually the Apple-Shazam merger, it was referred to the EU Commission by the Austrian competition authorities. So we will see how this will work. We will see whether these mechanisms will catch too many fish, as the French competition authority said. They also thought about introducing these thresholds, but then they decided not to, because this would really increase the workload of both the French competition authority and also the companies. So now France, as an alternative, is considering post-merger review of post-consummation review of mergers, and in that sense, it has to. This was announced very recently, And the idea is that if it's going to have a very substantial effect on competition in the French markets, then the French Competition Authority would like to interfere. But of course, this is the idea of the substantive impact is also quite, can be quite subjective. So now they're looking for, they launched a public consultation, and now they're looking for ways as to how we can really limit this this kind of intervention, and what is the best way to go about this. And a third way an existing way of looking at these mergers is the share of supply test. And actually, I think I'm personally leaning more towards the share of supply test, and it's applied in the UK. In the UK, notification is not mandatory, but if the parties, it can be one of the parties or all the parties, if their share of supply, so it's not market share, it's their share of supply. If it's about 20% or more, if it's going to be 20% or more after the merger, then the UK Competition Authority can interfere and actually analyze the merger. And I think this might be a better way for at the EU level instead of the value threshold. Because if you just want to catch these kind of disruptor acquisitions, then the acquirers, Google, Facebook, or Amazon, they easily pass the share of supply test. So this might be a good way of dealing with disruptor acquisitions. So once we notify these mergers, then we have to move on to market definition, because, well, this is the traditional idea of merger review. So of course, with disruptive innovation, market definition becomes quite problematic. Why? Disruptors, they don't necessarily, their business models or technologies, they don't necessarily overlap with existing markets. So of course, we have to go beyond our idea of substitutability when we look at disruptive innovation. I'm saying that, but unfortunately, in practice, it's not really happening. For example, when the EU Commission reviewed the Marriott-Starwood merger, it was a big hotel merger, and the idea, when the parties announced this merger, the idea was that, well, we got to be more efficient to be able to compete against Airbnb and apartment lets or house lets. But maybe because the merger was not really a problematic one in the European Commission's sense, that then they didn't actually include Airbnb in the analysis. But Airbnb is not even mentioned in the decision. So I think that's quite problematic from a competition perspective. So of course, I'm saying that, but defining the market becomes extremely hard when you want to include Airbnb in the analysis, for example, because Airbnb doesn't own actually any of the apartments that are let on the website. So how are we going to define the market? Are we going to take Airbnb as another hotel, or are we going to take the apartment owners as market players? It becomes quite challenging. So in any case, because of that, I think market definition kind of starts to lose its importance when it comes to disruptive innovation. Maybe we should go outside the traditional idea of let's look at the parties, let's define the markets, let's find the affected markets, and then calculate market shares. I think disruptive innovation forces us to necessarily go beyond that in some cases. But in other cases, for example, in the French Competition Authority analyzed the merger of Fnac's acquisition of Darty, and there they actually considered brick and mortar stores to be in the same market as e-commerce, and they managed to analyze disruption together with the traditional business model. And I think this was a very dynamic and forward-looking approach that analyzed the market dynamics better than simply saying, well, e-commerce is a different market and brick and mortar stores are a different market. So beyond that, there's also another problem. Beyond the disruption of industries, there's also the problem of course, multi-sidedness when it comes to defining markets in these mergers, because of course it's not specific to disruptor acquisitions. I mean, a lot of mergers happen in a lot of multi-sided markets, but this is also one thing we have to consider in these mergers. And when I take all of them together, I think the result I reach is as based on multi-sidedness. If you're looking at a multi-sided market, and most of the time in these mergers we are, the price-centric market definition tools, they have to be set aside because most of the time, in some of these mergers, we don't even have the product on the market. So how are we going to define the market based on, based on the SNP test, for example? A lot of people actually argue for abandoning the market definition altogether, but I don't think it's a good idea because it's a very it's a very important aspect of computational analysis, and I argue for being more practical in a way. We cannot just, I think, if you say, no, don't define the market to a computational authority in a very important merger, I really don't think in practice it's going to happen, so I'm not going to argue for that. But an alternative to that might be defining broader markets, and some scholars argue for that. Then if we define the market more broadly, then we can include disruption, such as the Fnac-Darty merger. But at the same time, if we define the market broadly, then we might actually make a merger, instead of that merger being horizontal, if we define the markets broadly, it might become a conglomerate merger. And we have the guidelines in Europe. This, as we know, the analysis of mergers differs greatly when it's compared to horizontal mergers if it's a conglomerate merger. Conglomerate mergers are not considered to be problematic, actually. So this may not be the best way to go. But another way of going about this might be to delineate markets based on the business model. So we can look at who steals profits from whom in a particular merger. This would be the case of, for example, if Facebook was acquiring Snapchat. We know that Snapchat is, although Facebook and Snapchat are not exactly the same product, Snapchat steals profits from Facebook. That's obvious. And there's also another idea, is the idea of attention merchants, attention markets, the idea of competing for eyeballs. This might also be a good way of analyzing competition. But I think in any case, in these mergers, the importance we attribute to market definition and the traditional analysis of let's define the market and then let's look at the market shares, I think it's we have to think outside that box when it comes to these mergers. But there are certain ways of these ways. I think some of them at least can be tailored to the merger in the specific case. So once we go beyond the definition of the market, so how do we understand, how do we analyze the dynamics of competition in these mergers? So there are, well, first of all, actual competition, but actual competition is something we look at once we define a market and then understand who is competing with whom actually on the market. But beyond that, in these disruptive acquisitions, one other framework for the competition analysis can be analyzing potential competition. Excuse me. Potential competition, why it can be useful in terms of disruptive acquisitions? Well, first of all, especially in the EU, traditionally, the analysis of potential competition is also reliant on market definition. And what we mean by potential competition is imminent entry, basically. And it has to be timely, likely, and sufficient. And then, if it's timely, likely, and sufficient, the competition authority takes that into account. It can be important for the disruptor acquisitions because in some cases, for example, in the Stairs Synergy merger, which was a merger in the US, and Synergy had a product in the EU, but it was planning on entering the US market with that product, and the product might have had a disruption effect in the US market. So in that sense, when Stairs was acquiring Synergy, the courts in the US, they considered this element, but at the same time, it was found out that Synergy had actually dropped the idea of entering the US market. But in that sense, since we can have disruption among geographic markets, the potential competition, the idea of potential competition can be useful. But again, in the computational analysis, it is limited to the market definition. So because of that, And since we know that the market definition may not necessarily work in disruptor acquisitions, potential competition theory may not be sufficient to understand the dynamics of competition in these acquisitions. So one other framework that has been used is innovation competition, and this appeared with the idea of innovation markets again in the 90s, and Gilbert and Sunshine put forward this idea. But the idea of innovation markets is if we have or innovation competition and innovation markets, if we have two parties conducting R&D in similar lines of research, then such a merger between these two parties may affect competition. And this was there. I'm not. It's a bit long, but I'm not gonna delve too much into that. But this has been evolved, and we came to the point of innovation competition and analyzing innovation competition in EU competition law. In a very recent case, we saw that the Dow-DuPont case. The innovation competition theory works better in terms of incremental innovation, because again we have the idea of R&D and analyzing the R&D lines of the parties, the R&D activities of the parties, or imminent R&D activities of the parties. So it might work better for incremental innovation cases, and this was not necessarily used very much in practice. But in Dow-DuPont, we actually saw, although it's an incremental innovation case, we actually saw the EU Commission go beyond its established framework of analyzing just pipeline products in a agrochemical merger. They analyze innovation spaces, and these are the early ideas of innovation of the parties. And the Commission actually looked into that to understand the dynamics of competition between the parties. Although this relies on R&D efforts, it can still be useful for I think disruptor acquisitions, especially if the company that is being bought doesn't have a product on the market yet, but we can still see its development activity. In that sense, I think innovation competition theory might work for these acquisitions. But since it is reliant on R&D, maybe it's not suitable for every kind of disruptor acquisition. And we can complement that with the future markets theory. And future markets comprise markets that are not yet existent. And we saw this happen in the Nielsen Arbitron merger in the United States. It was actually applied, and in this sense, in this case, for example, these two parties, one of them was qualified in analyzing viewership in television, and the other one in radios. And there was a new product being developed, not yet on the market, and this product was analyzing viewership across different media channels. And if I'm not wrong, it was the FTC. The FTC, in its analysis of the merger, considered that these two parties, although this product was not yet on the market, these two parties were best placed to develop and market such a product, and therefore, and when this product was on the market, it would. When this product came into the market, sorry, I've been a bit sick and a bit hazy, so I apologize for my slowness. Since these parties will be best placed to develop and market this product, the authority thought that they would be competitors in a future, not yet existing market, and analyze this in the competitive analysis. So I think this is also a good forward-looking analysis when it comes to disruptor acquisitions that can be applied. We have these frameworks, and then after we analyze the merger, what are the theories of harm? What are the theories of harm that we can use? Or what are the theories of harm that show us that this merger might be problematic? So the first one is obviously the most traditional one is the strengthening of a dominant position. And this was considered in the Microsoft LinkedIn merger. In Microsoft LinkedIn, of course, it was because of consumer data. But in any case, if we understand that there's an element of competition between the merging parties based on their business models, for example, this would have been the case in Facebook, WhatsApp, but unfortunately, that was also a miss. If we see that these are two competitors or two potential competitors merging, then we might have the strengthening of a dominant position. So this is the more traditional theory. We can also apply the Maverick firm theory. So the Maverick firm theory in competition law, it's actually traditionally it's a maverick that hampers collusion in a market. But in 2010 U.S. merger guidelines, the Maverick firm was actually also in the definition of the Maverick firm. A disruptive innovator was also added to the guidelines, and if a Maverick firm is being acquired by an incumbent, the guidelines say that this would also be considered in the merger analysis. So we don't have that in the EU, but I think this would be a very good way of analyzing disruption in mergers. We have the idea of downward innovation pressure. It was put forward by Shalansky. I'm not aware of any cases where this was actually used. It's also based on the idea of innovation competition. And Shalansky argues that if post-merger the parties' incentives to innovate they decrease, especially in the sense that one of for example, the acquiring party decides not to market the product of the potential disruptor, basically kill the product before it even sees the market. This would be an anti-competitive factor in the analysis of the merger. And of course, it's currently, as the things currently stand, it would be maybe hard to block a merger based on this theory. But it should still be, and in my view as well, it should still be considered. And how can we understand that? Of course, then we have to look at the internal documents of the parties. It's again a bit contested, but I think it's a good way of understanding the future of the disruptor's product. And Shapiro goes one step beyond, and he puts forward the contestability, appropriability, and synergy scenario. And according to him, even if the parties decide not to, even if it looks like the parties may decide not to put forward the disruptor's product on the market the product on the market, it might be that the incumbent has ways of appropriating the startups or the disruptor's product. So this increases the chances of the product being put on the market, and also the merger can create such synergies that even if the product is killed, then the merger might still be allowed. Of course, I think the synergies theory is a bit far-fetched, because even arguing efficiencies, saving a merger based on efficiencies is quite currently hard, especially in the EU. But at least in terms of contestability and appropriability, I think this gives us a good idea of how what the incumbent intends to do with the innovation. And finally, we have a new theory of harm, innovation theory of harm. So in the Dow-DuPont merger, we saw that the EU Commission used the idea of innovation spaces, but there was actually one other element in the merger. Beyond innovation spaces, the Commission argued that this merger would decrease the innovation incentives in the industry as a whole. And this theory of harm actually existed in academia, in theory, but the idea is mostly that this would work in markets that are heavy with R&D. So maybe it may not be the best scenario when it comes to analyzing disruptor acquisitions, but still, if we have R&D activities, I think it might still be applicable in our case. So these are the theories of harm that I think could be applicable in these cases. And when it comes to remedies, I think this is very general, and I haven't researched that yet. So if you have any ideas, please put them forward. I think behavioral remedies instead of structural remedies might work better in these cases. For example, if you think about Facebook, WhatsApp, if we had a remedy of Facebook saying, well, even if I can merge the data one day, I will not merge it. This kind of a commitment might have resolved the case from the beginning. And also, I really liked the idea of experimentalism yesterday. Maybe it's not so applicable for mergers, but at the same time, we are dealing with markets that are very new and nobody really understands them yet. So we have to understand that we might make mistakes. So I think we also have to learn from our mistakes, and merger retrospectives, going back to the market and analyzing the effects of the market 2 years, 5 years, even 10 years after the merger. I think this would be a good learning exercise for competition authorities. So what is the result? I personally think that we have enough. We have already a lot of tools to start with in analyzing disruptor acquisitions, but again, we are within the established frameworks of merger control. So, as many authors and businessmen argue, we also have to disrupt ourselves. Hopefully, it will happen soon, and I'm looking into how we can do that with my PhD. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yasar. It was a quite comprehensive analysis of this merger from the perspective of disruptive innovators. And now, if you have questions or suggestions or comments, you can of course, there, Sophia.
Thank you very much. That's actually something that I didn't mention due to time constraints. One of the reasons why our traditional understanding of substitutability changes when it comes to disruptive innovation is precisely that. Actually, Airbnb, according to many studies, Airbnb made the cake bigger, sorry, not maybe better, I don't know, but definitely bigger. So people who couldn't actually afford or didn't want to go to hotels, now they use Airbnb. So in this sense, it's in terms of demand-side substitutability, we have different consumer groups, obviously. Some Airbnb consumers would not go to hotels, and some hotel consumers actually would not go to Airbnb. Therefore, I think there's still an element of competition, but based on our traditional idea of demand-side substitutability, using the Smith test, etc., they don't look that substitutable. You're absolutely right about that. So that's why I think the market definition, there's an element of substitution that we cannot actually include in the analysis based on our traditional idea of market definition. And I understand that. And I think the remedy to that, we don't necessarily have to include that in market definition. I think it can still be something that this substitutability, it can be an element included in the competitive analysis, not necessarily in the market definition. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Yes, we have one here. We're taking just the two of you, okay? Because we're out of time. Sorry. For next time.
No, this is more of a clarification question, but you mentioned at some point that it would be more interesting to look at the share of supply instead of the share of the market among players. But I was wondering if you apply it to digital markets, especially social networks, for instance, how would you measure supply? That's very important.
actually, in practice, the share of supply test is more. I think I see it personally as a more flexible way of calculating market shares. It's not you don't really define the market in the traditional sense of competition. Also, just as for example, you can maybe in terms of search, you can calculate it based on clicks or users. So there are, maybe I should look at that. Maybe I should look more at that. But it's basically if your market share is above 90%, for example, Google's market share is above 90% in Europe. The European Commission has established that. Then the share of supply test would also be satisfied, and the merger would become notifiable. I think it's a more relaxed way. I think it can be based on what I've read, it can be calculated in any way, basically. I mean, it's maybe a bit arbitrary, but more arbitrary than market shares, but that's the idea.
Okay, thank you. Two comments. I think the first comment is more conceptual. So you're using disruption, innovation, a concept which is, I think, quite established by now. But mixing different things in that conception. So you're bringing also sustained innovation, disruptive innovation. So I'm just wondering, how do you see this as a conceptual challenge? There is a reason that people are trying to distinguish sustained innovation from disruptive innovation. So bringing all those concepts into just one umbrella, would you think that that's problematic? And my second comment is in relation to the use of the Maverick theory. I mentioned under the regular. Yes, in principle, as you mentioned, it's very good coordinated conduct or disrupting coordination. But in practice, it seems to be that the Commission actually applies it to unilateral effects. So if there is an income that is trying to apply with Maverick, and they see the potential of eliminating that Maverick, in practice, in the three small cases that come with the Maverick theory, it was actually more about unilateral effects rather than coordinated effects. So it's similar in principle, but that is verify that reason I think is actually surveying the use of the Maverick theory
Thank you very much. In terms of your first question, I was just showing the contrast. I don't wish to bring sustaining innovation into the analysis. I think they are separate phenomena, and just one thing is since a lot of cases are based on sustaining innovation, and we have very few cases of disruptive innovation, we can be inspired by those cases and tailor their ways into the analysis of disruptive innovation. In terms of the Maverick firm theory, I just want to, I don't recall any EU cases of unilateral theory, but my research was mostly whether there's a disruptive innovator being acquired by an incumbent and this theory being used. And in the EU, I'm not aware of any such cases. That's what I was trying to say. And it's not in the guidelines either. At least in the US, it's in the horizontal guidelines. But I will definitely look into it. And in any case, I think we both agree that it can be tailored into the disruption analysis. Thank you.